I was still in my white wedding dress, my makeup untouched, the congratulatory bouquet spilling from every surface in the living room, when my mother-in-law, Brenda, abruptly pulled a dark suitcase from the corner of the room. She placed it firmly on the coffee table, the thud making everyone in the room jump and turn. At that moment, I thought she was about to retrieve a wedding gift envelope or some ceremony-related documents, so I just sat still. But the next second, as the latches clicked open and she pulled out dozens of thick files, shoving them toward me, an unsettling feeling immediately washed over me. Brenda looked me straight in the eye, her gaze completely different from the warm, gentle demeanor she had maintained throughout the 3 years I had known her son. Her voice was cold. "From today, your family, and there's something I think you need to know." I frowned slightly. "What is it, Brenda?" She didn't answer immediately, but took a paper from the stack of files and placed it in front of me. After just a few lines, I saw it was a bank loan agreement, then another, and then another. I began to realize this wasn't a normal loan. My father-in-law, Robert, sat beside me, constantly looking down and smoking, not daring to meet anyone's gaze. My husband, Michael, sat motionless like a stone statue. The atmosphere in the room suddenly became heavy, almost suffocating, and then my mother-in-law concluded with a sentence that made me think I'd misheard her. "This family currently owes a total of nearly $300,000. From now on, as our daughter-in-law, you and Michael are responsible for paying off that debt." I froze for a few seconds, a ringing sound in my head. Nearly $300,000, right after the wedding. I looked at Michael. He still had his head down, offering no objection, no denial, no surprise. That detail alone was enough for me to understand he knew everything beforehand. The cheerful laughter from the wedding just hours ago seemed to linger in the air. Yet, at this moment, I felt as if I had been pushed from heaven into a deep abyss. My mother-in-law continued, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. She explained that a few years ago, their construction materials business had been very prosperous. Then, seeing many people making money from real estate, they decided to borrow from the bank to invest. Initially, they made huge profits, and the more they earned, the more they borrowed. When the market froze, they couldn't sell the land. Interest accumulated day by day, and loans stacked upon loans, ultimately forming a mountain of debt. I listened quietly, not interrupting with a single word. What chilled me wasn't the amount of money, but the fact that this entire situation had been hidden until after I officially became their daughter-in-law. If they had told me the truth earlier, Michael and I could have discussed it and found a solution together. But they didn't. They chose to wait until the wedding was over, until I was legally and emotionally part of the family, and then they dropped the bombshell. That wasn't sharing a burden, it was a premeditated trap. You're a chief accountant, you make a good 6-figure salary, and I hear you have personal savings too. The two of you can work hard for a few years and pay it off, my mother-in-law continued. I stared at her for a long time. For the first time in my life, I realized that some people could utter completely unreasonable things with an utterly calm expression. Nearly $300,000. No, it wasn't $300, not $3,000, but nearly $300,000, an amount that, even if Michael and I worked tirelessly for many years, we might not be able to cover based on salaries alone. But the way she spoke, it was as if it were just an unpaid utility bill. I turned to Michael. "When did you know about this?" Michael was silent for a few seconds before quietly replying, "About 2 years ago. My heart felt like it was being squeezed. 2 years. That meant throughout our 2 years of dating, preparing for the wedding, choosing venues, taking wedding photos, planning our future, he knew his family was burdened with this colossal debt." "But you never said a word to me. Why did you hide it?" I asked. Michael lowered his head. "I was afraid of losing you." An answer that sounded sincere but made me hurt even more, because it proved he had chosen his own self-interest over the respect due to the woman he loved. My mother-in-law began to lose patience. She said bluntly, "Well, let bygones be bygones. The important thing now is to find a way to pay off the debt. We're family. We have to shoulder this together." I looked at every face in the room. My father-in-law still had his head down. Michael remained silent. Only my mother-in-law seemed agitated. not out of concern for her son's future, but because she had finally found someone to share the burden, a burden that her family should have taken responsibility for themselves. A strangely clear-headed feeling began to settle in my mind. I didn't cry, didn't get angry, didn't bang on the table and stand up like in TV dramas, because I understood that emotions wouldn't solve anything at this moment. The only thing I needed was the truth, the entire truth. I reached out and flipped through the files, bank loan agreements, mortgage documents, interest payment receipts, overdue notices. Each paper was like a knife cutting into the trust that had been built over many years. But the more I looked, the more I realized something. This family was not as bankrupt as they were trying to appear. Among the documents, there was information about the 3-story house we were currently in. There were deeds for 2 plots of land on the outskirts, a lease agreement for a rental workshop, and a storefront business still operating. This meant they still had assets, and the total value of these assets might even exceed the debt. The problem was, they didn't want to sell. They wanted to keep the assets in their name while pushing the debt repayment obligation onto Michael and me, and especially onto me. I gently placed the file back on the table. My mother-in-law immediately asked, "You understand now, don't you?" I nodded. I understand. A hint of satisfaction flickered in her eyes. Perhaps she thought I had accepted the fate of a docile daughter-in-law. But then I slowly continued, "I agree to handle this debt." The room immediately brightened. Michael looked up at me, surprised. My father-in-law looked up for the first time. My mother-in-law almost smiled. But before she could say anything else, I continued, "With one condition." The smile on her face froze. I looked each person straight in the eye. If I have to bear a debt of nearly $300,000, and all of the family's assets must be transferred to Michael and me for management. The house, the land, the workshop, the store, everything. The space seemed to freeze. A crash echoed, and the teacup in my father-in-law's hand fell to the tiled floor, shattering into many pieces. My mother-in-law was stunned. Michael's eyes widened. No one expected the daughter-in-law who had only entered the house a few hours ago to make such a demand, and I knew that from that moment, the real battle had begun. That night, after everyone had dispersed from the living room, I was led up to the bridal suite on the 3rd floor. Just hours before, I had imagined it would be the beginning of my happy life. But now, the room decorated with heart-shaped balloons and red ribbons made me feel suffocated. Michael followed me into the room, gently closing the door, then leaned against the wall like someone who had just survived a battle. I sat on the edge of the bed, taking off the high heels I had worn all day, my feet aching, but not as much as the feeling of betrayal gnawing at my heart. We both remained silent for a long time. The silence was so heavy that I could clearly hear the ticking of the wall clock. Finally, I spoke first. "Were you really going to hide this from me forever?" Michael lowered his head. "I planned to find the right time after the wedding to tell you." I let out a laugh, a dry, hollow laugh that even I found unfamiliar. The right time would have been after I signed the marriage certificate, or after I got pregnant, or after I gave birth. Michael couldn't answer. I looked at the man I had once trusted implicitly and realized that for the first time in our 3 years together, I didn't understand him anymore. Before, whenever I faced difficulties at work, he was always the one to encourage me. When my father was hospitalized due to a stroke, he was the one who tirelessly helped me for weeks. It was because of these things that I believed he was a responsible man. But it turned out a responsible man would never let the woman he loved enter a marriage so blindly. I couldn't sleep all night. Near dawn, when Michael had fallen asleep from exhaustion, I opened the briefcase of files I had brought upstairs and began to meticulously review each document. As a chief accountant, I had a habit of looking at financial records with a very different eye than the average person. It only took about 2 hours for me to notice irregularities. The nearly $300,000 debt my mother-in-law mentioned was actually formed from many different loan agreements. There were bank loans, unsecured loans, and real estate secured loans. But what caught my attention most was the list of collateral. The 3-story house the family lived in was valued at nearly $500,000. One plot of land in Northport was worth about $150,000, another in Spring Hill about $130,000. a workshop currently being leased in Glendale, a construction materials store on Main Street still operating normally. I sat silently, looking at the numbers appearing before my eyes. If I added up the total value of the assets, the figure far exceeded the current debt. In other words, this family was not in a hopeless situation. They still had many valuable assets. They just didn't want to sell them. They wanted to keep everything they owned while finding someone else to shoulder the financial burden. And that person was me. The next morning, as I walked downstairs, my mother-in-law was already seated in the living room, a hot cup of tea and a stack of heavily annotated papers on the table. She looked at me and smiled, a smile that, yesterday, I would have taken as concern. But after everything that had happened, I only saw it as calculation. "Did you think it over carefully last night?" she asked. I sat down opposite her. "I'm still reviewing the files." She nodded. "Our family is struggling now. I just hope the two of you can work together to get through this." I looked her straight in the eye. "I see the family still has many assets." Her face stiffened slightly, but she quickly regained her composure. "We have assets, but selling now would be a loss. Land prices are dropping. Selling means losing everything." I gently asked back. "Then why ask me to pay?" The question made her pause for a few seconds. Then she replied in a less than pleasant tone, "Your family. Family has to make sacrifices." I didn't say anything more, but a very clear thought emerged in my mind. If I agreed to shoulder the debt unconditionally today, tomorrow they would ask for even more, because human greed, once indulged, never stops. In the days following the wedding, I began to observe my in-laws with a different perspective, and the more I observed, the more chilling things I discovered. In front of relatives and neighbors, my mother-in-law always complained that the family was on the verge of bankruptcy, that the bank was about to seize assets, that life was so difficult they didn't know where to turn. But the reality was completely different. She still went to the spa regularly every week. My father-in-law still played golf with his old business associates. A $75,000 SUV was still parked in the driveway. The construction materials store still had customers coming and going every day. The workshop still collected monthly rent. Of course, I understood that assets didn't equate to cash, but if they genuinely wanted to deal with the debt, they could absolutely sell off some assets. What they couldn't accept was losing ownership. 3 days after the wedding, I accidentally overheard a conversation between my in-laws in their study. As I walked past, I clearly heard my mother-in-law say, "Good thing Michael married Sarah." My father-in-law quietly asked, "Will she agree?" She immediately replied, "She'll have to. She loves Michael, and she has a good salary and her own condo before getting married. She wouldn't just watch her husband's family go bankrupt, would she?" I stood frozen outside the door. Every word was like a bucket of cold water thrown directly on my face. It turned out my suspicions were not wrong at all. From the very beginning, they had calculated the possibility of using my financial resources to save their family. Perhaps they hadn't actively orchestrated this marriage, but when they learned I had a stable job, good income, and my own assets, they saw me as a lifesaver. That evening, I asked Michael to meet me on the balcony to talk. The early summer breeze blew gently, but it couldn't cool the tense atmosphere between us. I asked him a question I'd been pondering for many days. If I didn't have my current job, no savings, no private condo, would your family have agreed to let us get married? Michael was silent for a very long time. That silence was the answer. I turned my face to look at the dark sky in the distance. For the first time since entering this marriage, I felt truly alone. But along with that disappointment, a sense of clarity was also slowly forming. I was no longer the naive bride of a few days ago. I understood that this battle wasn't just about money. It was a battle for trust, for rights, and for fairness. If I wanted to survive in this family, I couldn't act emotionally. I had to use logic. Just then, my phone suddenly rang. It was an unknown number. I picked it up, and on the other end was a middle-aged man's voice. "Is this Sarah Miller?" I replied, "Yes, this is she." The man then said something that sent shivers down my spine. "We are the lenders. We need to meet your family to discuss the overdue loan. If it's not paid within this week, we'll have to take further action." Then he recited my in-laws' home address before hanging up. I slowly lowered the phone. In the yard below, my mother-in-law was still laughing and chatting with a neighbor, as if nothing had happened. But I knew the real storm had begun to gather, and the secrets this family had hidden for many years were probably far more terrifying than anything I had seen in the stack of files on my wedding day. The phone call from the man claiming to be a creditor left me unable to calm down. All that night, I tossed and turned in bed, listening to the steady hum of the air conditioning, my mind a chaotic mess. What worried me wasn't just the nearly $300,000 debt, but the feeling that things weren't going to stop there. My professional instinct always told me that numbers never lie. Yet, what my in-laws were telling me had too many holes. If the debt was truly only nearly $300,000, with their current assets, they were perfectly capable of handling it. So why would the creditor call with such a tense tone? Why would my mother-in-law rush to push the responsibility onto me right after the wedding? And why did Michael always evade my questions whenever I tried to delve deeper into the family's financial situation? The next morning, I decided to take a day off work. I used the excuse of needing to settle down after the wedding, but in reality, I wanted to investigate everything myself. After Michael left for work and my in-laws went to the store, I quietly took the files into the living room and began to meticulously review each page again. This time, I didn't just look at the loan amounts. I cross-referenced the dates, interest rates, and collateral. After just over an hour, I discovered a very suspicious detail. In the list of documents my mother-in-law had given me, there was a gap spanning almost 8 months. This meant that there were loans that appeared suddenly without any documentation explaining the cash flow. That could only mean two things. Either they deliberately concealed part of the records, or there were other undisclosed debts. The more I thought about it, the more uneasy I became. Just then, the doorbell rang. I walked to open the door and saw two middle-aged men standing at the gate. One wore a white shirt, the other a dark jacket. Both had tense expressions. The man in the white shirt looked at me and asked, "Is this Mr. Robert Miller's residence?" I nodded. He immediately said, "We're here to meet Mr. Miller about an overdue loan." I asked, "Which loan?" The man looked at me searchingly for a few seconds before replying, "A loan of over $80,000. We've contacted the family many times, but they keep postponing." I was stunned. Over $80,000. This debt was completely absent from the documents my mother-in-law had given me. I tried to stay calm. "I apologize, I'm new to the family, so I'm not fully aware. Could you please leave your contact information?" The two men exchanged glances and then handed me a business card. Before leaving, the man turned back and said something that made my heart pound. "If the family continues to delay, we will be forced to take legal action." As soon as the gate closed, I immediately went back inside the house. My hands trembled as I held the business card. A debt of over $80,000 was not in the files. This meant my suspicions were entirely correct. My in-laws had hidden more from me than they admitted. That afternoon, when my mother-in-law returned, I confronted her directly about the new debt. At first, she feigned surprise, but only a few seconds later, her expression changed. I recognized it as the reaction of someone whose weak spot had been hit. "Ah, that's an old one. I forgot to give it to you," she said quickly. I looked her straight in the eye. "An $80,000 debt you forgot?" She fell silent, and I understood that things were far from simple. That evening, for the first time since the wedding, I proactively called for a family meeting. The four of us sat around the dining table, but no one touched their food. I placed the business card on the table. "I want to know the actual total debt." No one answered. I continued, "If you want me to help resolve this, at the very least, I need to know the truth." My mother-in-law immediately reacted. "Are you investigating your own family?" I maintained a calm tone. "No, I'm protecting myself." That statement silenced the entire table. My father-in-law lit his third cigarette in less than half an hour. Michael continuously avoided my gaze. Finally, it was my father-in-law who spoke, his voice hoarse. "The current total debt is about $350,000. The spoon in my hand paused. $350,000. That was over $80,000 more than the figure they had announced on our wedding night. My mother-in-law immediately turned to look at her husband as if to stop him, but it was too late. I felt the blood in my veins turn to ice. A feeling of both anger and disappointment welled up in my throat. So, not only did they hide the debt before the wedding, they continued to hide more debt even after asking me to pay it off. Michael lowered his head. I was going to tell you eventually. I laughed. Eventually, again. The atmosphere became heavy to the point of suffocation. After a few minutes of silence, my father-in-law began to recount the entire story. 3 years ago, when the real estate market was booming, he and Brenda continuously borrowed money to buy land. Initially, they made a lot of money. Some plots of land bought 1 month later would sell for a profit of hundreds of thousands of dollars. Such easy success made them believe they could see into the future. They sold their old store to invest more heavily. They mortgaged their house. They borrowed from banks and even from private lenders at high interest rates. But then the market suddenly froze. The plots of land that had constantly been bid on suddenly had no buyers. Bank interest alone amounted to thousands of dollars each month. To pay one loan, they borrowed another. In this way, the debt ballooned. Listening to this, I understood this wasn't a story of people facing unexpected misfortune. This was the consequence of greed and recklessness. What I found most difficult to accept was that even knowing everything was collapsing, they still chose to hide it from me until the very last minute. Just as the meeting seemed to be ending, my mother-in-law suddenly slammed her hand on the table. But regardless, you're our daughter-in-law. You can't just stand by. I looked up. I never said I'd stand by. She immediately asked, so when will you start helping? I looked at her for a long time. In my mind, everything that had happened since I stepped into this house flashed before me. The lies, the hidden debts, the silent calculations behind the friendly smiles. And for the first time, I understood that if I wanted to protect myself, I couldn't be soft-hearted. I slowly replied, I stand by my condition. My mother-in-law frowned. What do you mean? I looked at each person and enunciated every word. All assets must be transferred to Michael and me for management. Only then will I consider handling the debt. Brenda's face immediately changed color. But this time, I didn't back down because I knew one thing very well. If they truly wanted to save the family, they would accept sacrificing assets for a chance at survival. But if they only wanted to keep their assets and push the responsibility onto me, our battle had only just begun. After that family meeting, the atmosphere in the house changed completely. If before my mother-in-law still tried to maintain a pleasant demeanor, now she barely bothered to conceal her discomfort. I understood the reason very well. The condition I had set hid exactly what she feared most. Not the $350,000 debt, but the risk of losing control of the assets she had always considered her life's achievement. In her eyes, I was no longer the sweet daughter-in-law who had just entered their home. I'd become a threat, and from that day on, pressures began to emerge in various ways. Initially, it was indirect comments during meals. Every time the family sat down to eat, my mother-in-law would deliberately bring up how a woman must sacrifice for her husband's family. She told stories of the neighbor's daughter-in-law who sold her jewelry to help her in-laws pay off debt, or about a distant niece who took out a bank loan to save her father-in-law's company. Each story ended with the same conclusion. People who live with kindness and loyalty are blessed. I listened to everything but didn't react, because I knew it was just a way to exert psychological pressure. When she saw I wasn't swayed, she switched to a different tactic. Within a week, a series of my in-laws' relatives began to appear. First an aunt, then a grandaunt. Even people I had only met once at the wedding started dropping by. At first, they inquired about life after marriage, but after a few pleasantries, the conversation inevitably turned to the family's debt. Dear, it wasn't easy for your in-laws to raise your husband. Family members have to support each other. Money can be earned back, but lost affection is hard to regain. These words sounded reasonable at first glance, but the more I heard them, the more amused I became. No one asked how I felt about being lied to for 3 years of dating. No one asked if I felt deceived. In their eyes, it seemed perfectly normal for a daughter-in-law to bear her in-laws' debt, yet the fact that the in-laws concealed a $350,000 debt before the wedding was seen as something that could be overlooked. One evening, after seeing off a distant uncle, I sat alone on the balcony. Michael came and sat beside me, his face looking much more haggard than before the wedding. I knew he was caught between two sides, his parents and his wife, but that didn't make me feel any better. Michael was silent for a long time before finally speaking. "Can you be a little less stubborn?" I turned to look at him. "You think I'm being stubborn?" Michael sighed. "My parents are under a lot of pressure." He scoffed. "And what about me?" He didn't answer. I continued, "Do you know what the most painful thing is? It's not the debt. The most painful thing is that I was deceived. If you had told me everything the first day we met, I would have had the right to choose. But you took that right away." Michael lowered his head. After a while, he said, "I just wanted to keep you." I shook my head. "No, you wanted to keep someone who could save your family." That statement silenced him. That night, for the first time, we slept with our backs to each other. An invisible distance was slowly growing between us, but that wasn't the most surprising thing. 2 days later, I discovered an even more frightening truth. That day, I took half a day off work to deal with some personal matters. When I returned home earlier than usual, I accidentally overheard my mother-in-law talking on the phone in the living room. Perhaps she thought no one was home, so she wasn't careful. I stood behind the door and clearly heard every word. "It's fine, sis. She has her own condo in her name." The person on the other end said something. She replied, "Oh, the condo in Riverton. It's worth over $100,000. If needed, we can sell it." I was stunned. That condo was bought with my savings after nearly 10 years of working. Before getting married, I had explicitly told Michael that it was my personal asset. He had agreed. But now, my mother-in-law was planning to use that very condo to settle her family's debt. What was more frightening was her completely natural tone, as if that asset had always belonged to their family. I didn't enter the living room. I quietly went back upstairs, but something inside me had changed. In the following days, I actively started gathering more information. With my financial background, I knew that to truly understand the situation, I couldn't just listen to one side. I sought to check public records related to real estate, businesses, and mortgages. What I discovered surprised me. My in-laws were not in as desperate a situation as they portrayed. In addition to the assets I already knew about, they also owned shares in a construction materials distribution company. The value wasn't huge, but it was enough to generate a steady cash flow. The workshop in Glendale was still being rented for nearly $2,000 a month. Although the construction materials store's revenue had decreased, it was not operating at a loss. In other words, this was not a poor family. This was a family in debt due to misguided investments, but they still had many resources to save themselves. What they didn't want to do was sacrifice their assets. They wanted to keep everything and find someone else to pay the price. And that person was me. That evening, I laid all the information I had found in front of Michael. He looked at each paper, his face gradually paling. "Where did you get these?" I replied calmly. "It doesn't matter. What matters is, did you know?" Michael was silent. That silence gave me my answer. He knew. Perhaps not everything, but certainly more than he admitted. I looked my husband straight in the face. "Do you see the problem? Your family isn't without a way to pay off the debt. They just don't want to lose their assets." Michael sat motionless for a very long time. Finally, he quietly said, "Those are my parents' life's work." I nodded. "So why should I use my assets and my hard work to protect those things?" That question silenced him completely. Just then, my father-in-law's phone suddenly rang. He answered it right in the living room. The voice on the other end was so loud that I could vaguely hear it. Just a few seconds later, his face turned white, his hand holding the phone trembling. My mother-in-law rushed out from the kitchen, asking frantically, "What's wrong?" My father-in-law slumped onto the couch, his voice hoarse. "The bank just sent a final notice. If the overdue amount isn't paid within 30 days, they'll initiate foreclosure proceedings on the mortgaged assets." The entire house fell silent. My mother-in-law stood frozen in the middle of the living room. Michael's face was pale, and I understood very well what that meant. The game was entering a new phase, and this time was no longer on my in-laws' side. The foreclosure notice from the bank was like a bomb exploding in a house already full of tension. From that evening on, I could clearly feel the panic slowly engulfing everyone in my husband's family. My father-in-law no longer maintained his composure. Phone calls came in constantly from morning till night. Some days he sat in his study all afternoon, calling one person after another, then quietly smoking until his eyes were red. My mother-in-law became increasingly irritable. Even a small matter was enough to make her explode. But what struck me most was that her attitude toward me began to change in a very strange way. Before, she used sweet words to persuade. When that didn't work, she switched to exerting pressure through emotions and morality. But now, with the bank having officially issued an ultimatum, she began to genuinely fret, and the first person she sought out was still me. One weekend morning, as I was about to go out, she called me back. "Sarah, I want to talk." I turned back into the living room. She was already seated on the sofa, a notebook, and a stack of papers in front of her. For some reason, seeing that scene, I felt like I was about to enter a negotiation, not a conversation between a mother-in-law and daughter-in-law. She looked at me for a long time before finally speaking. "Do you know what the consequences will be if the bank forecloses on this house?" I replied calmly. "I know." She continued, "Robert and I will lose everything." I nodded. "I know that too." She waited for a reaction from me, but there was none. Finally, she said directly, "Do you really want to see this family fall apart?" I looked at her. This was the first time she had asked that question so directly, and it was also the first time I decided not to avoid it. "The one driving the family to ruin is not me." She immediately blanched. "What do you mean?" I took a deep breath and spoke slowly. "I wasn't the one who took out the loans. I wasn't the one who invested in real estate. And I wasn't the one who hid the debt before the wedding. So why is all the responsibility falling on me?" The room immediately fell silent. Brenda's expression shifted from surprise to discomfort. Perhaps no one had ever spoken to her like that before. She was always accustomed to others yielding, accustomed to everyone listening to her, but I was no longer the girl who entered this house with the eager mindset of a new bride. I had seen too much, and I had no intention of continuing to be easily exploited. The conversation ended in a heavy atmosphere. That afternoon, I returned to my own condo in Riverton to pick up some personal belongings. I had bought this condo 3 years ago with my savings and a bank loan that I paid off monthly myself. It was the fruit of nearly a decade of hard work. Every time I stepped inside, I felt a sense of security. It was the only place where I felt like everything was still under control. But that day, as I opened the door and walked in, I unexpectedly received a call from Michael. His voice seemed tense. "Where are you?" I replied. "At my condo." He was silent for a few seconds before saying, "Can I come see you?" About an hour later, Michael arrived, his face visibly exhausted. We sat opposite each other in the living room, neither of us saying anything for a long time. Finally, he spoke first. "My parents are really under a lot of pressure." I didn't answer. He continued, "The bank has given a final deadline." I remained silent. Michael lowered his head and then said what he had probably prepared beforehand. "How about we sell this condo?" The space seemed to freeze. I looked at my husband and couldn't believe my ears. In that moment, any last hope I had for him almost completely vanished. I had thought that at least Michael would understand my feelings, that after everything that had happened, he would stand in the middle and try to protect both sides. But no, in the end, he still chose his family, and his chosen method was to suggest selling my asset. I let out a bitter laugh. "What did you just say?" Michael avoided my gaze. "I just thought if we sold the condo, it would help resolve part of the debt." I asked again. "Then what about the house in Northport? The land in Spring Hill? The workshop?" He remained silent. There was no answer. I stood up. "Why are your parents' assets untouchable, but my assets can be sold so easily?" Michael couldn't say anything, because he himself understood the absurdity of his suggestion. But what hurt me even more was that he still said it. When a man truly loves you, he will find a way to protect you from hardship. But when he loves his family more, he will try to persuade you to sacrifice for them. I looked at my husband, whom I had married less than a month ago, and suddenly realized the distance between us had grown so wide that I couldn't see the end. That evening, I returned to my in-laws' house very late. As soon as I entered the yard, I heard arguing from the living room. My father-in-law was yelling at my mother-in-law. This was the first time I had seen him lose his temper like that. "I told you to sell the land last year." He slammed his hand on the table. "You refused." My mother-in-law was just as defiant. Who knew the market would turn out like this? He let out a bitter laugh. "When people were offering a high price, you were greedy. Now that everything's lost, who's to blame?" I stood silently outside the door. Those arguments unintentionally confirmed what I had long suspected. This family was not a victim of circumstances. They were victims of their own greed. If they had agreed to sell assets earlier, perhaps they wouldn't be in this situation. But they always believed that land prices would rebound, always believed that luck would continue to be on their side. And now that everything had collapsed, they wanted to find someone else to bear the consequences. Just then, my father-in-law's phone rang again. He answered it, and then his face suddenly turned pale. The entire room immediately fell silent. Just a few seconds later, he put the phone down on the table, his hand visibly trembling. My mother-in-law hastily asked, "What's wrong?" He looked at her and replied in a hoarse voice, "They just called to say an investor is asking about buying the Northport land." My mother-in-law's eyes immediately lit up. "For how much?" My father-in-law gave a hollow, bitter laugh. "Only half the price we refused last year." The entire room fell silent, and in that moment, I knew a truth no one wanted to admit. This family was at its final crossroads. Either accept losing assets to save their future, or continue to cling to greed and lose everything. After the call about the Northport land being valued at only half of what the family had refused last year, the atmosphere in my in-laws' house became heavier than ever. Arguments between my mother-in-law and father-in-law became more frequent. If before they tried to save face in front of me, now almost no one bothered to hide it anymore. Every morning, I woke up to the sound of slamming doors and arguments echoing from the first floor. Some days, as early as 6 in the morning, my mother-in-law would loudly blame my father-in-law for his mistaken investments. In the evening, my father-in-law would blame her for being too greedy and not selling the land when the market was hot. The recriminations repeated like an endless cycle. Michael, meanwhile, grew increasingly silent. He left for work very early and often returned very late. I knew he was trying to escape reality, but the more he avoided it, the greater the pressure became. A week later, I noticed something very strange. Although the whole family continuously complained about hardship and constantly talked about the risk of foreclosure, my mother-in-law stubbornly refused to sell any assets, even when someone had inquired about the Northport land, even when the bank sent a second warning letter. That made me begin to suspect. I didn't believe someone backed into a corner could calmly hold on to their assets like that, unless she was still hoping for something, or she was hiding a secret I didn't know about. And then, an opportunity came quite by chance. It was a Wednesday, and my mother-in-law told the family she had to go meet an old friend to borrow money. About half an hour after she left, her phone, which she had forgotten on the dining table, started ringing continuously. I don't usually answer other people's phones, so I intended to ignore it. But when the screen lit up, a text message appeared that caught my attention. The sender was saved as David Springfield. The content was just one sentence. "Don't worry, sis. No one knows about the land yet." My heart skipped a beat. What land? Why no one knows yet? An uneasy feeling immediately arose. I didn't touch her phone, but from that moment, my mind started thinking in a completely different direction. That evening, during dinner, I deliberately brought up the topic of real estate. I've noticed many people selling land to pay off debts, which makes sense. My mother-in-law immediately replied, "There are some plots of land that can't be sold." I asked again, "Why not?" She paused for a second before saying, "Because selling now would be a loss." The answer sounded normal, but the fleeting look of discomfort in her eyes didn't escape me. From that day on, I secretly began to investigate. With my current job, I had quite a few connections in finance and real estate. After just a few phone calls, I gradually pieced together fragments I had never seen before. The first thing I discovered was that before investing in the losing land plots, my in-laws had owned a fairly large plot of land in Springfield. This land had been bought more than 10 years ago for a very cheap price. Its current market value was estimated to be around $300,000 to $350,000. But the strange thing was that, in all the asset documents the family had given me, there was no information about this land whatsoever. I thought I might be mistaken, so I continued to check. The results surprised me even more. That land was not in my in-law's name. It was in the name of a man named David, the same name that had appeared in the text message the other day. I sat in silence for a long time in front of my computer screen. If this information was true, the entire story had changed. My in-laws weren't just hiding debt, they were hiding assets. An asset worth nearly the entire current debt. And that meant that from the beginning, they were not in the desperate situation they presented to me. They were fully capable of solving most of their difficulties if they wanted to. But they didn't want to touch that secret asset. They wanted to keep it for themselves. Meanwhile, they were trying to push the responsibility onto Michael and me. This truth made me both angry and disappointed, but instead of confronting them immediately, I decided to continue observing. I wanted to know what else they were hiding. 3 days later, something unexpected happened. That afternoon, as I was leaving work, I received a call from a bank employee I knew. We had collaborated on a financial project a few years ago. After a few pleasantries, he asked me a very strange question. "Hey, is your husband's family trying to restructure their loan?" I was startled. "How do you know?" The person replied, "Someone just asked about the possibility of transferring assets to a relative's name to avoid foreclosure." I froze for a few seconds. "Which relative?" He laughed. "I can't say, but you should pay attention." The call ended, but my mind was still racing. That evening, when I returned home, I noticed my mother-in-law had just gotten back from somewhere. In her hand was a new stack of documents. When she saw me, she immediately put them away in her private room. That hurried action only strengthened my certainty that she was doing something behind everyone's backs. In the following days, I noticed that my father-in-law seemed unaware of the land in Springfield. At least, he didn't know the whole truth. In their arguments, he always complained that the family was about to lose everything. Someone secretly holding an asset worth nearly $350,000 would not say that. That made me begin to suspect that even my father-in-law was being kept in the dark about part of the story. And if that was true, my mother-in-law wasn't just deceiving me, she was deceiving her own husband. Everything gradually became clearer one evening when I accidentally overheard a phone call between her and the man named David. She was in the backyard, so she didn't know I was nearby. Her voice was very quiet, but I could still hear a few phrases. "Not yet. Wait a little longer." There was a pause. Then she continued, "If we transfer the title now, they will know." I stood frozen. They. I didn't need her to explain who she was referring to. Probably Michael and me. Just then, my phone vibrated. It was a text message from my lawyer. The content was brief, but enough to make me understand that the battle was about to enter a completely new phase. Michael's family's loan has been reclassified as non-performing. The bank is preparing further legal procedures. I looked up at my mother-in-law's silhouette standing in the backyard. For the first time since stepping into this house, I felt I had touched the real secret. And I knew that if the truth about the Springfield land was exposed, not only would my mother-in-law's plan collapse, but this entire family would face a shock greater than any argument before. Since the night I overheard my mother-in-law's phone call with the man named David, I knew I couldn't just sit back and wait for things to unfold. If I wanted to protect myself, I had to be proactive, to get a step ahead. And for the first time since entering this marriage, I decided to consult an attorney. She was an old friend of my older sister, specializing in property law, marital disputes, and civil litigation. I didn't tell her everything at once. I simply brought a folder containing the debts my in-laws had disclosed, the information I had gathered about their existing assets, and my personal notes from the past month. After nearly 2 hours of review, the attorney leaned back in her chair and asked me a question. "Do you have evidence that they were aware of the debt situation before the wedding?" I nodded. "My husband knew for at least 2 years." She continued, "And they didn't inform you?" "No." The attorney was silent for a few seconds before saying something that surprised me. "Then you have no legal obligation to those debts." I looked at her. "What do you mean?" She explained very clearly that most of the loans originated before the marriage and were either in my in-laws' names or related to their investment activities. In principle, according to the law, I was not automatically responsible for those debts just because I became their daughter-in-law. If I hadn't co-signed, hadn't stood as a co-borrower, and hadn't entered into a separate agreement, no one could force me to pay. I sat in silence. Although I had somewhat understood this in my heart, hearing an attorney confirm, it felt like a heavy weight had been lifted from my chest. But what caught my attention most was her next statement. However, I looked up. She looked at me for a long time and then said, "If what you suspect about hidden assets is true, then the story changes." I told her about the land in Springfield, about the man named David, and the unusual signs I had noticed. After listening, she didn't draw any immediate conclusions, but she said something that made me think deeply. The one who is most afraid in this story might not be you. On the way home, that sentence kept replaying in my mind. The one who is most afraid might not be me. Indeed, the more I reflected, the more I realized something. All this time, I had been on the defensive. They were the ones hiding debt. They were the ones exerting pressure. They were the ones trying to persuade me to sacrifice. But in reality, the ones truly facing the risk of losing everything were them. If the bank foreclosed on their assets, they would lose their home. If creditors sued, they would lose their land. If the secret about the hidden asset was exposed, all their calculations would collapse. As for me, I still had my job, my own condo, and the ability to stand on my own 2 feet. For the first time after weeks of tension, my mind felt clearer. That evening when I returned home, I unexpectedly found Michael sitting alone in the backyard. He looked much older, just in a little over a month. I walked over and sat beside him. Neither of us said anything for a long time. Finally, Michael spoke first. "I'm so tired." His voice was hoarse. I understood he wasn't just tired from work. He was being crushed between the pressures from his family and our increasingly fractured marriage. "Did you ever think things would turn out like this?" I asked. Michael gave a sad smile. "No." He looked up at the dark sky and continued. "Back then, my parents made money too easily. You'd buy a plot of land today, and a few months later, sell it for a profit of hundreds of thousands. We all thought it would last forever." I listened quietly. When things started to go bad, everyone believed the market would recover. Then, month after month, year after year, he trailed off. I knew the rest. Greed always makes people believe that luck will return tomorrow. That very belief had pushed them into the abyss. Just then, the front door opened. My mother-in-law walked in with an unusually tense expression. She didn't greet anyone, but went straight to her private room. About 10 minutes later, the sounds of an argument between her and my father-in-law began to echo. But this time, something was different. It wasn't the familiar accusations. My father-in-law's voice was louder than usual. "How much longer are you going to keep things from me?" Michael and I looked at each other, and we both immediately stood up. As we approached the study door, we clearly heard my father-in-law slam his hand on the table. "I just met David!" My heart tightened. That name had finally appeared. Inside the room, my mother-in-law was silent for a few seconds before replying, "Were you following me?" "I wasn't following you," he called me. The air seemed to freeze. I stood outside the door, my heart pounding. My father-in-law continued, his voice trembling with anger. "What about the land in Springfield?" A long silence. Then my mother-in-law finally spoke. "I just wanted to keep a way out for the family." "A way out?" My father-in-law let out a bitter, sarcastic laugh. "Or a way out for you?" The words that followed stunned both Michael and me. It turned out the land in Springfield did exist, and just as I suspected, it had not been included in any debt repayment plan. Many years ago, when the family began earning money from real estate, my mother-in-law had secretly bought that plot of land for herself, using an acquaintance's name, asking him to keep it a secret from everyone, including my father-in-law. While the family was continuously borrowing, mortgaging assets, and sinking deeper into debt, she had secretly kept a nest egg for herself. Even when the threat of foreclosure loomed, she had no intention of using it to save the family. I turned to look at Michael, his face pale. Perhaps this was the first time he had known the truth too. My father-in-law's voice from inside continued. You let me bear the debt. Let our son be squeezed between two sides. Let the whole family live in fear while you hid an asset worth nearly $350,000. My mother-in-law burst into tears. But this time no one was sympathetic because everyone understood the issue was no longer about money, but about betrayal. Just then my phone vibrated. It was a text message from the attorney I had met that morning. The content was just one short line. If that asset exists, you have a bigger advantage than you think. I looked at the screen, then slowly raised my head. In the room ahead, my in-laws were beginning to confront the biggest secret of many years, and I understood one thing very clearly. From this moment on, the tables had completely turned, and for the first time since the wedding, the one holding the cards was no longer my mother-in-law. After the night the secret about the land in Springfield was exposed, the already tense house became even more suffocating. There were no longer complaints about overcoming difficulties together. No more moralistic stories about family loyalty that my mother-in-law used to exert pressure. Instead, there was suspicion, disappointment, and wary glances. My father-in-law barely spoke to my mother-in-law for several days, and Michael fell into a terrifying silence. Perhaps he had never imagined that the mother he always respected could hide such a huge secret from the entire family. As for me, after the initial shock, my mind became clearer than ever, because now I saw the whole picture. The enormous debts were real, the risk of losing the house was real, but at the same time, the idea that the family had no way out was a lie. They still had assets, they still had options. It was just that someone didn't want to give up their own interests, and that someone was my mother-in-law. 2 days after the argument, I received a call from the bank informing me that the debt restructuring application had moved to its final stage. If the family couldn't present a viable payment plan within the next 3 weeks, foreclosure procedures would be initiated. When I heard this, I wasn't surprised. I had anticipated it, but one person began to truly panic, and that was my mother-in-law. She no longer maintained her rigid demeanor. Secret phone calls became more frequent. She constantly went out to meet someone and returned with a worried expression. Some nights, I even heard her pacing in the living room. Someone who had tried so hard to cling to her private assets was now starting to feel the risk of losing everything, and that was when I knew the opportune moment had arrived. That evening, I proactively suggested that the entire family sit down and talk. No one objected. Perhaps everyone understood that this situation couldn't drag on indefinitely. We sat around the familiar dining table, but unlike previous times, no one was in the mood to eat. In front of each person was just a glass of water. My father-in-law sat deep in thought, smoking. Michael bowed his head, contemplating. My mother-in-law continuously clasped her hands together, a sign that she was very tense. I looked at each person and then calmly spoke. Tonight, I want to finalize everything. No one interrupted. I continued, it's been over a month since the wedding. During that time, I've learned about the $350,000 debt. I also learned about all the existing assets, and now I know about the land in Springfield. As soon as she heard that, my mother-in-law's face immediately paled. But I didn't stop. I don't want to argue anymore, and I don't want to hear any more explanations. The atmosphere in the room grew heavy. I took a folder from my handbag and placed it on the table. This is my final plan. All eyes immediately turned to me. I opened the folder, and inside was a summary of all assets and debts that I had prepared over many weeks. Every number was clearly detailed. I pointed to the spreadsheet and said, if we sell the Northport land, sell the workshop, and use part of the value from the Springfield land, the entire debt can be managed within 1 year. My father-in-law looked up. He watched very intently. Michael, too, for the first time, truly paid attention to what I was saying. Only my mother-in-law remained motionless. I looked at her and continued, I still stand by my original promise. She subtly looked up. I enunciated each word. I will take charge of managing and settling the entire debt. The room immediately fell silent. My father-in-law put the cigarettes he was holding down in the ashtray. Michael looked at me unblinkingly, and my mother-in-law seemed to hold her breath. I knew what they were thinking. After more than a month of confrontation, I was finally giving in. But they were wrong, I continued. On the condition that all assets must be legally transferred to Michael and me for management, my mother-in-law immediately shot up. "No, you can't." Her voice was almost a shout. But this time, I wasn't surprised. I had anticipated that reaction. I calmly looked at her. "Why not?" She fumbled for a few seconds and then said, "Those are my and Robert's assets." I nodded. "And the debt is also yours, and Robert's debt." My reply choked her. I continued, "If you want me to help resolve this, I must have the authority to make decisions. No one pays off debt while the assets remain in someone else's hands." The air in the room became as taut as a violin string. My father-in-law looked down at the spreadsheet in front of him for a long time, then unexpectedly spoke. "Keep going." This was the first time he had actively supported listening to me. I took a deep breath and presented the entire plan. "If the management rights of the assets are transferred to Michael and me, I will work with the bank to restructure the loans. I will sell inefficient assets. I will renegotiate with other creditors. I will use my financial experience to lead this family out of crisis. But to do that, I must have full decision-making power. The situation where one person bears the responsibility while another holds control cannot continue." After nearly half an hour of presentation, the room fell into absolute silence. My father-in-law was the first to break it. He looked at me and slowly said, "If we do it your way, the family still has a chance." I saw a change in his eyes. For the first time since I entered this house, he looked at me as someone who could help solve the problem, not just a newlywed daughter-in-law. But immediately, my mother-in-law objected. "Are you really going to hand over all the assets to her?" My father-in-law turned to look at her, his gaze colder than I had ever seen. "Do you have a better plan?" That question silenced her, because everyone knew the answer was no. All this time, she had only tried to hold on to the assets, but had never offered a way to save the family. Just then, Michael unexpectedly spoke up. His voice was very quiet, but loud enough for everyone to hear clearly. "I agree with Sarah." The entire room seemed to freeze. My mother-in-law whirled around to look at her son, her face white. Perhaps this was the first time Michael had openly sided with me. He took a deep breath and continued, "If we keep going like this, we'll lose everything." No one said another word. Only the ticking of the wall clock echoed in the silent room. I looked at my mother-in-law's distraught face and understood that for the first time in many years, she had truly lost control of the situation. But I also knew the battle wasn't over, because people who spend their lives clinging to assets wouldn't let go so easily. Just then, my father-in-law's phone rang again. He answered it, and after only a few seconds, his expression immediately changed. When he hung up, he looked at the whole family with a heavy gaze. "The bank just informed us." He paused for a few seconds. "They're only giving us 10 more days." The entire room fell silent, and I understood that from this moment on, no one could delay the decision any longer. The 10-day deadline given by the bank felt like a countdown clock hanging right in the middle of the living room. No one spoke it aloud, but everyone felt the immense pressure bearing down on the house. After that meeting, my father-in-law, Robert, changed noticeably. He no longer sat complaining or trying to escape reality. The very next morning, he proactively called the person who had previously inquired about buying. Although the price was half of its peak, he still wanted to renegotiate. But the call lasted less than 10 minutes. When he hung up, he sat silently in his chair. "The buyer backed out," he said. "The market continues to decline. The land that was once offered over $300,000 is now worth less than $150,000, and still, no one dares to put money down." I saw for the first time genuine helplessness in my father-in-law's eyes. My mother-in-law, Brenda, grew increasingly panicked. She no longer opposed me vehemently, but she also refused to accept my conditions. She kept clinging to hope, believing that some miracle would appear. Some days she'd sit for hours in front of the family altar, muttering prayers. Other days she'd call old friends, former business partners, hoping to borrow more money to buy time. But everyone refused. The difficult market meant no one dared to take risks. 3 days later, a major incident occurred. That afternoon, as the whole family was eating dinner, the doorbell rang persistently. Michael got up to answer it. Outside were 3 men in white shirts wearing bank IDs. Accompanying them was someone from a law office. The atmosphere in the house immediately became as taut as a string. The lead man politely introduced himself and then presented a stack of documents. It was the official notice about processing the collateral. Although they weren't initiating foreclosure immediately, this was the final step before everything went to auction. My mother-in-law looked at the documents, her hands trembling uncontrollably. She repeatedly said the family was trying to make arrangements and pleaded for more time. But the bank representative just shook his head. They had already given too many chances. After the group left, the house fell into an unprecedented gloomy silence. That night, for the first time, I heard my mother-in-law cry. It wasn't the kind of crying meant to exert pressure or elicit pity. It was the cry of someone who was beginning to realize she could truly lose everything. But what surprised me most happened the next morning. When I came downstairs, my mother-in-law was already seated in the living room. In front of her was a blue folder. Her face looked haggard after just a few days. She looked at me and said in a hoarse voice, "I want to talk." I sat down opposite her. For a very long time, she didn't speak. Finally, she pushed the folder toward me. "These are the documents for the land in Springfield." I looked at her. For the first time since I stepped into this family, I saw no calculation or dominance in her eyes, only weariness. "I know what you're thinking," she continued. "You think I'm selfish, and maybe you're right." I remained silent. She gave a faint, sad smile. "But do you know why I hid that land?" I shook my head. She gazed distantly out into the yard and slowly recounted. Many years ago, when the business was doing well, she witnessed a relative go bankrupt overnight, all assets seized, home lost. From then on, she always lived in fear. When they started investing in real estate, she secretly bought that piece of land as a backup plan. Initially, it was just to prepare for the worst, but then, as money came too easily, greed set in. She thought she could keep it forever. She thought everything would never collapse. Until today, when she finished, she lowered her head. I was wrong. It was the first time I heard her admit a mistake, but things had gone too far. Just then, my father-in-law walked in. He placed another stack of papers in front of everyone. "I thought about it all night," he said. He looked at me and continued, "If you still keep your promise, I agree to transfer management of the assets to you and Michael." The room immediately fell silent. Michael looked up at his father, utterly surprised. My mother-in-law gently closed her eyes. I understood how difficult that decision was for them. Those assets were the fruit of their entire lives. But at the same time, I also understood that if they didn't make a decision now, they would lose everything, not just the management rights. The next 2 days were the most stressful period since I married Michael. We worked continuously with the attorney, the bank, and other involved parties. All documents were re-examined. Assets that could be sold were prioritized. Debts were categorized by urgency. For the first time after months of chaos, everything began to have a clear plan. But just then, another shock emerged. On the afternoon of the 8th day, within the final deadline, an outside creditor unexpectedly arrived at the house. Unlike the bank, these people were not polite. They shouted loudly right at the gate. Neighbors began to gather and watch. The reputation my in-laws had tried to maintain for so many years vanished in an instant. My mother-in-law slumped into a chair, her face drained of all color. My father-in-law quietly bowed his head. And Michael, for the first time, stood up to face them all. He walked out to the gate and talked to them for nearly an hour, then returned. His face was tired but much more resolute than before. That evening, when everything had quieted down, Michael found me on the balcony. He stood for a long time before speaking. "I'm sorry, I didn't answer," he continued, "not just for the debt, but for everything." I looked at the man beside me, the man who had once disappointed me, who had once made me feel betrayed, but also the man who was slowly changing after these events. If I had told you the truth back then, he left the sentence unfinished, and I understood the rest. If he had told me the truth back then, maybe things would have been different. Maybe we still would have gotten married, maybe not, but at least there wouldn't have been the deceit. Just then, my phone received a call from the attorney. After a few minutes of conversation, I slowly hung up. Michael looked at me. "What's wrong?" I took a deep breath and replied, The asset transfer documents are complete. We'll sign officially tomorrow." Michael was silent for a few seconds. Then, for the first time in many months, I saw him sigh in relief, as if a huge burden had been lifted. But I knew very well that tomorrow wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of another battle. The battle to save this family from the wreckage they themselves had created, and also the battle to determine whether my marriage still had a chance to survive. The next morning, as the sun rose, I was at the notary's office with Michael, Robert, and Brenda. On the table were dozens of folders prepared over many days. If I were to go back to more than 2 months ago, when I was an eager bride entering this marriage, I probably never would have imagined myself sitting here under such circumstances. That day, I thought my new life would begin with plans for building a family, aspirations for the future, and the simple joys of a young married couple. But reality unfolded with colossal debts, years of lies, and a battle I never wanted to join. The notary read each clause, and each signature placed felt like a milestone closing the chaotic months behind us. My father-in-law signed first. He didn't hesitate. Perhaps after all, he had understood that clinging to greed would only make the family lose everything. Michael signed next, his face much calmer than in previous weeks, and my mother-in-law was the last. Her hand trembled as she held the pen. I saw conflict in her eyes. Not because she didn't understand the right choice, but because she never thought there would come a day when she would have to relinquish control over assets she had held for so many years. Finally, she signed. Her handwriting was shaky but resolute. In that moment, I knew everything had truly changed. After completing the procedures, I immediately set to work on crisis management. The first step was working with the bank. Thanks to the clearly organized asset records and a concrete payment plan, we were approved for loan restructuring. Next was negotiating with outside creditors. Not every meeting was easy. Some people were very aggressive. Some had been promised too much before, so they no longer trusted anyone. But unlike my in-laws' previous approach, I didn't avoid the issues. I confronted each problem directly. I presented a clear repayment roadmap. I committed to what was feasible and absolutely never promised what I couldn't deliver. Gradually, the situation began to change. 3 months later, the Northport land was successfully sold at a lower price than expected, but still enough to pay off a large portion of the debt. The workshop was transferred to another business. The construction materials store was restructured to continue operations instead of being completely shut down. Crucially, after many arguments, my mother-in-law finally agreed to use the value from the Springfield land to cover the remaining debt. That was the most difficult decision for her, but it was also that decision that saved the family from the brink of bankruptcy. A year passed faster than I expected. Looking back, even I was surprised by what had happened. The nearly $350,000 debt that had once panicked the entire family was now only a very small fraction, being gradually repaid according to plan. The bank halted all foreclosure procedures. Outside, creditors no longer pressured us. Life gradually returned to normal. But the biggest change wasn't the numbers in the bank account or the paid-off loans. The biggest change was the people. My father-in-law became much calmer. He no longer chased quick riches as before. Every morning he would go to the store early, working diligently like in the early days of starting his business. Michael also changed. The recent events had made him more mature. He learned that the truth, however difficult to accept, is always better than deceit. Some evenings, when only the two of us were on the balcony, he would still bring up the old story with remorse. If I had told you the truth back then, I always interrupted him before he finished the sentence, because the past cannot be changed. The important thing is what we have learned from those mistakes now. As for my mother-in-law, she changed the most. After the Springfield land was sold and most of the debt was resolved, she almost never mentioned assets again. Some weekend afternoons, I would see her sitting alone in the yard for a long time, not with regret, but like someone looking back at her entire life. One time, when only the two of us were home, she unexpectedly called me over. Her voice was much softer than usual. "Sarah," she said. I turned around. She was silent for a few seconds, then asked, "Are you still angry with me?" I looked to the woman in front of me, the woman who had once hurt me, who had once tried to force me to bear a huge debt right after the wedding. The woman who had tried to keep her private assets while pushing responsibility onto others. But also the woman who had paid the price with months of living in fear and regret. I sighed softly. I'm not angry anymore. Her eyes reddened. I'm sorry. Just 3 simple words, but I knew it had taken her a very long time to say them. I smiled gently. We all make mistakes sometimes. She lowered her head. Perhaps that was the first time since I became a daughter-in-law that we truly talked to each other like family. 2 years after the wedding, I stood on the balcony of our familiar house, watching the last rays of sunlight spread across the yard. Life isn't perfect. Every family has its conflicts and mistakes. But I understood one thing very clearly. What makes a family fall apart isn't debt, nor is it business failure. The most dangerous things are deceit and greed. When people prioritize their own interests over family bonds, everything will eventually break. But when there's enough courage to face the truth and take responsibility for one's choices, there will always be a chance to start again. That day, my mother-in-law had thrown a stack of debt papers on the table and demanded I pay for the entire family. If I had been weak then, if I had accepted unconditional sacrifice, perhaps all of us would have sunk to rock bottom together. But I chose a different path. A more difficult, tougher, but fairer path. And it was that choice that saved not only myself, but this entire family. My story ends here. If you, my viewers, found this story thought-provoking, please leave your comments below. What do you think? In my situation back then, would you have agreed to pay off your in-laws' debt? And if it were you, what conditions would you have set? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to follow the channel.